Aloha and welcome to Ehana Kako, which means let's work together. We're a weekly program on the Think Tech Hawaii Broadcast Network. I'm Keli'i AKina, president of the Grassroots Institute of Hawaii, and I want to welcome you whether you're here in Hawaii Nei, a beautiful, beautiful place, or another beautiful place somewhere across the world. And our broadcasts on Think Tech Hawaii go out across the world, and if you happen to be from some faraway place, come and help us build our economy, and we'll go and help you build yours. Today I'm delighted that we're going to take a look with an inside view into some congressional lives, gentlemen who have served our country with distinction for decades, who have really given their lives to the public good. I'm delighted today to have with us two former congressmen. We have Barry Goldwater, California Republican, who served in the House from 1969 to 1975, and Jim Chapman, Democrat from Texas, who served from 85 to 97. And we're going to just dive into their lives, their recollections of what it was to serve, what America is all about, and how perhaps they would solve today's problems if they were actively involved in Congress. But I want to welcome to our program these two gentlemen who are here with us in Hawaii. Representative Jim, aloha, Jim Chapman. Thank you for being here.
Glad to be here, glad to be in Hawaii, and certainly proud to be with you today.
Well, I'm delighted you've joined us today. And Representative Goldwater, thank you very much for joining us today.
Keli'i, that's nice being with you. It's always great to be in Hawaii.
Well, you know, you both were here. You've been here many times in your official capacity, probably for the most part working on some Asian missions, but not necessarily letting everybody know that you're basking in Hawaii.
I was here as young as 18 when I sailed some of the Transpac yacht races back to Los Angeles and San Francisco.
How about that?
Yeah.
And you've also been here many times.
I have.
Well, that's wonderful. You know, we're going to get into your lives a little bit. You have certainly distinguished records, and we're glad you're here. But I wanted just to start off by asking, and I'll start with Representative Goldwater. It was almost Senator.
That was my father.
But just with this question, you know, as you look at America today, or even as your father might look at America, what do you see? What do you see in America? What is our condition today?
Well, I think America is still a great country. We're still the land of the free. There's still millions of people who want to come here, not leave. So we're still a great country. But when you get down to the management of the country, I think we are basically lacking in strong leadership. Strong leadership that will really escalate and get us out of this recession that started back in 2008. It's been too slow in coming.
Sure.
So we need better leadership, not only at the top, but in the Congress itself.
Who would you look to from our past as being strong leaders in this 20th century?
Well, I look back as far as Bill Clinton was a good leader. He knew how to work with the Congress. The current president is having trouble. I look back at Ronald Reagan and even Richard Nixon. All had good relations with the Congress. Ronald Reagan, I think, was especially memorable because he was a good leader. He was liked by all people.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Chapman, how about you? Well, how do you assess America today?
Well, I think the country's strong. It's times are different today than they were a decade, 2, 3 ago. Problems that we face today are different. 9/11 changed everything.
Yes.
So our challenges are as great as ever, but our country is great. We are coming out of a recession. Business is good in America. Our trading relationships are good. Our trade is good. Our deficit's been cut in half in the last 5.5 years. We have a dysfunctional Congress, unfortunately. And answer your question about that, I do think we need strong leadership in Congress. But I think we also sometimes forget that the job of Congress is to govern. The job of the president is to govern. And the most important job is to work together for the good of the country. And that sometimes requires compromise. In fact, frequently requires compromise. And I think, unfortunately, we see much too little of that in today's politics.
Thank you. Mr. Chapman, what do you think is perhaps the greatest challenge that we are facing in the United States today?
Well, I think it's trying to focus around a core set of strategic principles and where we want to go. I think we all agree that large deficits are bad, debt's bad. We want a strong and growing economy. We've had a strong recovery, but unfortunately a rather jobless recovery. So we need to create jobs, good jobs for Americans. We need to strengthen our families. We need to strengthen business, and I think we need to continue to be smart and conservative in how we approach government.
Now, that's very interesting coming from you as a Democrat, that we need to be conservative, you say, and there's such diversity in the Democratic Party. Yet, when I listen to the things that you mention, I don't see a lot of difference between the goods you say we need to have and what Republicans say as well. What is your thought about the relationship between the parties today?
Well, I think at least in my case, it's more perhaps in style than in substance. I don't know anybody that's in a leadership role as a member of Congress, the House, the Senate, or the White House that's not for a strong economy, not for a balanced budget, not for jobs, not for growing economies and strong families. But there are major disagreements on how we achieve those goals. And therein lies a lot of the issue and a lot of the inability, it seems, to work through those problems in D.C.
Rep. Goldwater, what do you think some of those differences are in the way Republicans and Democrats try to go about achieving these goals of a stronger economy for all?
I think the difference is that the Democrats tend to think that only government is going to solve our problems, whereas a Republican looks more to the states, looks more to the individual. As a result, the Democrats don't seem to care whether we have this unbalanced budgets. We have a deficit of $17 trillion, which is equal to our gross national product. That's a debt that we're putting off to kids in our future. And the Democrats don't seem to be bothered by that. They just pile on more and more money. The Affordable Care Act is going to bust our budget. But more importantly is our economy. And I think we have monetary and fiscal policies. The fiscal policy is the Congress. Monetary policy is the Federal Reserve. And this approach that has been taken by the Federal Reserve has prolonged the recession, not solved it. It's sure bailed out Wall Street. It's bailed out the banks, but it's never trickled down to the consumer, to the little guy. The banks and the economy, a lot of that money's been going overseas, causing inflationary problems in Japan and China and other countries. That's been a problem. They prolonged the recession because normally recessions come out of with increased interest rates and a leveling off of the money supply. They've done nothing but expand the money supply and hold down interest rates, which is just prolonging the time that we're going to eventually come out of this recession.
Now, as you know, of course, in the recent State of the Union address given by President Obama, a more optimistic picture of the economy was expressed. And so I want to ask Mr. Chapman here how you weigh in looking at the American economy in light of what Mr. Goldwater has just said.
Well, probably not surprisingly, I have a slightly different view than my colleague in that view. As I recall history, we were losing 600,000 or 700,000 jobs a month in the latter years of the Bush administration. Obama inherited that mess, and here we are, 8 million new jobs later, 5 years into his administration. And while I don't think it's gone as fast or perhaps as that he would like, there are 8 million new jobs. The deficit's been cut in half. And talking about deficit spending and the lack of Democrats care about that, I would remind my colleague that both we started 2 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, put them on a credit card, refused to pay for either one of them. We expanded Medicare by providing a prescription drug benefit, put that on a credit card, and the greatest deficits from the standpoint of a percentage of GDP were run up in the previous Republican administration. So there are a lot of things we can do and should do, but you can't lay the economic or the problems with the economy in the lap of the Democrats or the administration. The Affordable Care Act, again, and as you view it, is over a 10-year period, is not deficit negative. It creates a surplus. So there are things that I would change probably if they ever put me in charge, but I look back at the last 5 years and think, thank goodness that we are coming out of the recession. Thank goodness business is doing good. The stock market has doubled, and our banks are stronger than ever. Our trade relationships are strong and growing, And that certainly wasn't the case the last time Republicans were in the White House.
Well, I'm sure you realize, Mr. Chapman, that many of the indicators of economic growth are interpreted differently by members of the Republican Party.
I understand that.
And we won't have time to go into all of them, but I was wondering what Mr. Goldwater thought about our employment situation. Both our president and Mr. Chapman say that in terms of unemployment, we're in a better situation today. But how would you parse those figures?
Well, I have a great respect for my colleague Jim Chapman, and he is an honorable person from Texas, served brilliantly in the United States Congress, but he looks at it through rose-colored glasses.
I knew the compliment was leading to something.
No, but obviously he believes in what he's saying, that our economy is great. We've created 8 million jobs, and everybody in the country's in great shape. But you talk to the person on the street, the person who doesn't have a job. You talk to the people who are getting laid off because of the Obamacare and have become part-time workers. The president talked about creating 1 million jobs last year. 45% of them were part-time workers. 45% of all the employed in this country are part-time workers. And that's because a great deal of it is because of the Affordable Care Act. So you get down in the trenches and away from Wall Street and the banks, and you talk to the average wage earner out there, the homeowners, they're not doing it so well as Mr. Chapman wants you to believe. Well, I think we can do much better. We need better leadership, and we don't want to be misleading the American people that everything's rosy.
Now, we'll come back and spend a little more time after our break on the Affordable Care Act. I'd love to see what both of you think about that. But I want to go back to a statement you made, Mr. Goldwater. You related the Affordable Care Act to an unemployment situation, and I just wondered if you'd explain that a bit to our viewers.
Well, what's happening is it's forcing American industry, businesses, to who have more than 50 full-time employees to provide health care or pay a penalty. It's much cheaper to pay the $2,000 fine and get rid of the health care that they had in place and force all those onto the exchange. And that's what a lot of industry is starting to do.
Sure.
The problem is when a worker goes from the company provided health care to the exchange, they're finding out they're having to pay more and get less coverage. That's one problem. The other problem that you have is that there's going to be a shortage of good doctors. You're starting to see it in school. Less and less students are signing up for doctors, because why would somebody want to spend 8 years becoming a doctor to make $100,000?
Okay.
So those are just two incidents of where it's impacting the unemployed in this country.
Well, we'll see as the numbers roll out as the implementation continues. But I would love to hear more of what you have to say about the Affordable Care Act, Representative Goldwater and Representative Chapman, when we return from a short break. This is Keli'i AKina with the Grassroots Institute, honored to be on the Think Tech Hawaii Broadcast Network. And we will be right back with Representatives Goldwater Jr. and Chapman after this short break. Stay with us, please.
I'm Hong Jiang, host for Asia in Review on Tuesdays.
And I'm David Day, host for Asian Review on Thursdays. Both of us broadcast our respective shows at 4 p.m.
And my topics tend to deal with questions related to environment, culture, history, and sometimes human rights.
And my shows tend to be on international business, foreign policy, geopolitics, and national security. And you can watch our shows live on the ThinkTech website at thinktechhawaii.com.
And you can also watch us on YouTube or Olalo.
So come join us on Thursdays at 4 p.m. I'm David Day.
And on Tuesdays at 4 p.m., I'm Hong Jiang.
Aloha, I'm Maria Kashem of Think Tech Hawaii, and I want to tell you about our Think Tech talk shows. If you didn't know it, Think Tech streams video and audio for all of its shows live on the internet from 2 to 5 p.m. every weekday afternoon, and we replay them all night long on Ustream.tv. Visit thinktechhawaii.com for our live stream and YouTube links. Raise your awareness on Think Tech. I'm Maria Kashem, and I'll see you there.
I can lead in with that question.
Aloha and welcome back to E Hana Kako. Let's work together. We're a weekly program on the Think Tech Hawaii Broadcast Network. And I want to say thank you to all of the crew and the producer of Think Tech Hawaii, Jay Fidel. You're doing a great job in taking issues that are both local and global and sending them around the world. Today we have the rare opportunity to talk with two former congressmen who have been through American history at a critical time, who've provided leadership both in their from their home states of Texas and California and across the nation as well. We're with Representative Barry Goldwater Jr. and Representative Jim Chapman, and just looking at the condition of America today from their vantage point, we want to get back and start talking about something that affects those of us in Hawaii and across the nation, the Affordable Care Act. And so without further ado, back to you, Congressman. Well, the Affordable Care Act, it's rolled out now, finally. Here in the state of Hawaii, we've looked at it very carefully at the Grassroots Institute. We actually had fairly good coverage, the highest in the nation for a single state prior to the federal Affordable Care Act through public and private partnership. We had effectively 93% of all workers here covered, and the remaining portion of the population were covered through charity and other benefits of the free market. And right now, we're going through some, at the very, well, perhaps a minimalist way to say it is we've got some rollout challenges taking place, and our level of coverage has dropped. But let me just throw it to you. Representative Chapman, what do you think about the national rollout, or just what do you think about the Affordable Care Act altogether now?
Well, yeah, the Affordable Care Act was a compromise, and it was not what the president wanted. It wasn't what the Congress wanted. It wasn't what the Democrats wanted or the Republicans wanted. It was what could pass. And it has obviously had, the rollout was not just stumbles, the rollout was a disaster. I did read this morning that there are now over 3 million have enrolled in the exchanges, and that they're probably about 1 million behind where they'd like to be. And considering they basically lost October and November completely, I think people are encouraged that the act at least is providing insurance for millions of Americans. The expansion of Medicaid has added another 6 million to the rolls of the insured. I'm not familiar with the Hawaii example. I am familiar with the Texas example.
Sure.
And Texas has the highest percentage of uninsured in America. We're the second largest state, but over 30, almost 34% of Texans have no health insurance whatsoever. And a majority of those are children. So Texas refused to participate in the expansion of Medicaid, which cost us another $1.5 million have been added to the uninsured rolls, or are part of the uninsured rolls, because our Republican governor refused to participate in the 100% federally funded expansion of Medicaid. So there's 1.5 or more million Texans that could have had health insurance at this point that do not, because of, quite frankly, partisan politics.
Sure.
They didn't want Obamacare to work in Texas. They've done everything they can to impede it. So in Texas, we desperately need to find a way to insure more Texans. The Affordable Care Act would have done that, but partisan politics have prevented it from happening. So my experience with the Affordable Care Act, the rollout has been anything but something pretty to watch.
Sure.
Now, but nonetheless, we have lots of time, as with the prescription drug benefit on Medicare, as with the original Medicare, to fix those things that are broken, and my belief is we will.
Now, Mr. Chapman, before I go to Mr. Goldwater here, because Grassroots Institute is a state policy network think tank, we've got a relationship with think tanks in other states, especially Texas. And some of the figures that we've heard, and I'd appreciate your comment on it, is that a good number of those who are considered uninsured include young people in their 20s and so who don't want insurance, include undocumented residents in the United States, include wealthy individuals who feel that their own net worth, their own assets are a better insurance policy, and so that the numbers actually of the uninsured are actually less if we take those into consideration. Any thoughts about that in Texas?
I think if you looked at, my daughter works for the Texas Hospital Association, if you look at the number of people who are getting their primary care medical benefits from the emergency rooms in Texas hospitals, you'll find it is enormous. maybe a few rich people that don't want to have insurance can afford it, but I would really question those statistics that you have just cited, because it is, I lived there, I know that, I was a congressman there for 6 years. I can cite you, we could spend the rest of the afternoon me telling you stories, the tragic stories of my constituents when I was in Congress, who fell through the cracks of the social safety net, be it Medicaid or a lack of insurance, and who had tragic consequences as a result.
Very good.
It is not a pretty picture in Texas, and tragically partisan politics are part of the reason.
Thank you, Mr. Chapman. Mr. Goldwater, not only tell us what you think about the Affordable Care Act, but whether you think it was partisan politics that actually is responsible for the dismal rollout that we have. What are your thoughts?
Well, when it passed the Congress, there was not one Republican vote in either house. It was partisan. It was the Republicans did not want it, and the American people didn't want it, and they still don't want it. It was rammed down their throat through parliamentary maneuvers and signed into law. It was a failure from the very beginning. It was not well thought out. It was not well administered. It was like if we took the whole nation and at 12 o'clock noon tomorrow, we stopped driving on the right side of the street and we'd have to turn and go drive on the left side of the street. That's the equivalent of that massive program, imposing it on the American people and expecting it to work. Well, let me just remind you, the only thing that the federal government does and does well is to collect taxes. The war on drugs is a failure. The Amtrak was supposed to be profitable. It's still broke. The post office had to be bailed out by $8 billion last year. Medicare and Medicaid is the biggest Ponzi scheme ever created by mankind. $60 trillion underfunded. There's nothing that the federal government does well, and you expect them to run a national health program? That is not the way. We had a pretty good system in the beginning that didn't need dramatic or drastic change. It needed to be, there were some real problems that needed to be corrected. We could have taken the 17 or 30, I'm not sure what number it was, of uninsured and put them into Medicaid. Medicaid was operating pretty well at the state level. If we'd have done that and then got the insurance companies more involved and kept the private sector involved, where you had choice and you could go to any place you want, we could have, that program would have worked. The Republicans were offering alternatives which were rejected left and right by the Democrats. And because of that, we have this massive failure. And in Hawaii, it's a failure. Your exchange programs are not working, as they are not working in any place else in the country that I know of.
Well, what's interesting is to hear the analysis from each of you, a Democrat, a Republican, lifelong. Mr. Chapman has spoken of the need of the federal government to come in when a state fails, when a governor may fail or a state legislature may fail, to act compassionately, caringly for the needs of its people. Mr. Goldwater, you've spoken of a fear of the growth and negative consequences of the growth of government's involvement in areas such as healthcare. Are we looking at two fundamentally different ways of thinking that define a Republican point of view and a Democratic point of view, Mr. Chapman?
Clearly. It is a fundamental, if not the fundamental difference in the two political parties in this country. Whether or not there is a responsibility of the federal government, in this case, to do those things, provide the social safety net, and to provide a certain level, one would argue, of health care benefits, a fundamental basic level, not perhaps a Cadillac, but a Chevrolet, for all of the American people. I would think the majority of Democrats probably think that as a basic fundamental right of citizenship, that we ought to have health care.
All right.
In fact, one would point out that we're the only industrialized country in the entire world that doesn't provide a fundamental level of health care as a national health insurance program. We're the only country in the world that doesn't do it. So I would be one that, and Barry and I would have a different view about this. I would be for a single payer national health care plan. I think that we should be as good, is every other industrialized country in the world in furnishing that to our citizens. And having been a member of Congress for 6 terms and having lived in the real world, I see the tragic consequence of not having that government policy every single day. And watching the children and the people and my friends, my neighbors, even in my family, who fall through the cracks.
Sure. Now,
And so I do think that's a defining difference in the parties.
Now, leaving aside whether or not people have compassion toward those in need, but taking a look simply at that structure, that the state is responsible for medical care, or even smaller units, counties, or even smaller units, the people, on one hand, versus the federal government needs to be responsible. Obviously, you have a different take on that, and we've talked about that, Representative Goldwater, in terms of the Affordable Care Act. But in general, do you see this, as Mr. Chapman does, as a defining difference between Republicans and Democrats?
There's no question. There's a major difference between a liberal and a conservative. Our founding fathers left England and tyranny to get away from centralized planning and administration of their lives. They came over here looking for freedom. The difference between a liberal and a conservative is that a liberal looks at the monetary side of a human being, whereas a conservative looks upon a human being as from the spiritual side. We look upon human beings as individuals endowed by their creator. They are spiritual beings. Each one of us are different. And if we put them all into a group, we confine them to slavery, versus letting them as free as possible to expand and to seek the highest level that they can. That is what this country is about, and that is what why a conservative looks upon government to be as less intrusive as possible. And the Affordable Care Act is the biggest intrusion into our rights as free individuals to seek our own health care, to manage our own health care, instead of having some bureaucrat 3,000 miles away deciding whether I need my tonsils taken out.
Well, Mr. Goldwater, for a moment there, although you parse differences between liberals and conservatives, I thought you were talking almost like a liberal when you were talking about caring for people and the individual and the rights of the person and the need to honor that. What would you say if, what do you say to that? Is this a commonality, or what is the difference?
I would agree with my colleague Jim Chapman here from Texas, that we both are compassionate. We're compassionate human beings, left or right. Wherever you're at, we Americans take care of each other.
Yes.
It's just the difference in how we approach it.
Well, I'm going to let...
Jim would be more of having Washington solve the problem. I would like to reduce that down to the state and down to the individual community and down to the individual.
Very good.
That was the greatest of our founding fathers, is push down the decision-making process to the lowest level where you get more people involved, instead of having some czar or a king at the top making those decisions for us.
Well, thank you, Mr. Goldwater. When we come back from the short break, I'm going to ask Mr. Chapman to give a quick response to that, whatever is on his mind, as we return to AKina Kako, our weekly program on Think Tech Hawaii Broadcast Network. I'm Keli'i AKina with the Grassroots Institute. Today we've got Representative Barry Goldwater Jr. and Representative Jim Chapman giving some reflections on how they see America. Come back and we'll pick up right after this short message.
We want to thank our underwriters.
Hawaiian Electric Company and its affiliates Maui Electric on Maui and Hawaii Electric Light Company on Hawaii Island are deeply committed to the communities they serve.
Galen Ho is a senior executive of BAE Systems, a global defense, security, and aerospace company.
The High Tech Development Corporation, the state's leading technology agency, attached to the Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism.
Castle and Cook Hawaii, with a time-honored legacy that spans more than 160 years and revolves around its mission of investing in Hawaii, creating communities, and providing for the needs of our state.
Hawaii Gas, formerly the Gas Company, a proponent of the Liquefied Natural Gas Initiative, helping Hawaii achieve its transition to clean energy and a better energy future.
Collateral Analytics, a Hawaii-based tech company empowering the real estate industry with greater and faster access to the tools and data they need to make better informed property investment decisions.
I'm Nicole Horry. Thanks so much for joining us on Think Tech.
I'm Maria Kashem. See you next time.
Welcome back to Ehana Kako on the Think Tech Hawaii Broadcast Network. I'm just having a lot of fun in the break talking to Representative Barry Goldwater Jr. and Representative Jim Chapman, Republican and Democrat. And one of the interesting things that I've noted in having lunch with them and seeing them together is their civility and gentlemanliness toward each other, hearkening back perhaps to a time that seems quaint now and a little bit in the past. But maybe I'll ask these gentlemen their thoughts about that. But first, I want to honor the fact that I said Mr. Chapman would have something to say, because we were talking about what the fundamental difference is between being a Democrat and being a Republican in America. And I'll tell you frankly, I wasn't sure that I had my finger on this when I heard Mr. Goldwater, because he was talking about people, caring for them, compassion, and so forth, which is something I often hear and usually hear from the Democrats. But I'm going to let Mr. Chapman weigh in on this. What do you think are some of those fundamental dividing differences?
As I listened to Barry describe the, for lack of a better word, perhaps the federalist notion of the 10th Amendment and pushing government down to the lowest level possible.
Or federal government.
Or federal government, well, or all governments, that to empower the people, to empower, for a government to empower its citizens at the lowest level possible, perhaps to get the job done or whatever it may be. I hear that, and I think there has got to be a sweet spot somewhere that where it works, because Democrats believe, and I think most Americans believe, there is an appropriate role for the federal government in the life of the nation and the life of the nation's citizens. What is that role? The logical extension, I fear the logical extension of Barry's argument is, if we push things down, and he cited a number of federal initiatives that have not perhaps been stellar, but nonetheless the logical extension of that argument would be, well, then the states perhaps should build our interstate highway system, or local governments should build our interstate highways. Well, if that's good, then why don't the states provide the militia and provide for the common defense? There are certain things the government has to do at the national level. National security, of course, is the most obvious. But our interstate highway system, that was an initiative born in Washington by a Republican, I might add, Dwight Eisenhower, and who expanded and built, and I might add, I think Congressman Goldwater's dad had a very instrumental role in the rollout of and the concept of our interstate highway system. So I believe, and I think a lot of Democrats believe, a basic level of health care fits in that category as something the federal government should be involved in. Social Security, whether you like it or dislike it, is a very popular program run from Washington. Medicare didn't exist until 1965. We didn't have it. But you start trying to take Medicare away from, maybe perhaps not Barry, but you take it away from me and I'll fuss, because it's a very popular program. And there are things, whether it be in healthcare, national security, transportation, infrastructure, things that government needs to do, and we're all in it together to improve the life of the nation.
Now, Mr. Chapman, in terms of the relationship between the states, the 50 states, and the federal government, are you saying that if the federal government does not act in some of these areas, such as the provision of health care or the provision of roads between the states, that the states would sit back and do nothing? Is that basically what you're arguing, to the detriment of the people?
Well, I would ask this question. Do you believe that we would have had the evolution of the interstate highway system in this country if we had left it to the states to do it?
That's a very good question, and I'm going to flip over to Representative Goldwater, but mention this. As you know, Senator Ted Cruz, amongst others, has proposed that we do just that the federal government remove itself from involvement in the interstate highway system and so forth, on the belief that states, as centers of competition, when left to work with each other, will work together in ways better than central control. Mr. Goldwater.
Let me just say,
please.
Just one point of that, and presuming if Cruz is being Cruz, and he is my United States Senator.
Yes.
Not my favorite, I might add, but nonetheless, he is my senator.
You're his constituent.
I am his constituent, and he is my United States Senator, my newest one. And the logical extension, of course, would be giving the infrastructure programs back to the state, would be, I presume, also raising the money at the state level. So let's imagine a federal highway program that leaves to each individual state the right to set how much the gas tax is going to be and how to develop that, how to pay for it, whether it's going to be 2, 4, 6 lanes, whether or not the bridges are going to be consistent, whether or not the interchanges, it would be a disaster. And I think that's a prime example, I think, of
speculation, Jim. You don't know it's going to be a disaster.
Mr. Goldwater, go ahead.
Common sense tells me it wouldn't work.
You can make the same argument for education. We've had the National Education Act for 30 years. Our scores are no better now than they were then, and education is a family affair. It's not Washington affair. Why are they in the business of telling the states and mothers and fathers how to educate their children? The federal government has no role in education, and that's just another area that and I don't know. The federal highway was part of the national defense, which is the requirement of the federal government, was to provide for the national defense. That highway fell into that. Okay, that's a nice little caveat that you present. The point is that under our founding fathers, they got away from tyranny and from centralized government, and they created a federal system of checks and balances between the feds and the states, and it works. It worked for a long time. And the problem that's going on in Congress today is because we've moved the pendulum too much to Washington. We've taken authority and responsibility away from the people and put it in the hands of bureaucrats in Washington who have no concept of what's going on, like in Arizona. For instance, the Environmental Protection Agency passes a law that the ambient air has to meet a certain quality. Well, all of a sudden we have dust storms in Arizona, and we get dinged. They take away our highway funds, or they take away our education funds because we have a dust storm. I mean, that's ridiculous to have somebody back in Washington come into Arizona and tell us what kind of air we're going to breathe. That's another area. So, I mean, there's a lot of areas where the federal government should not be involved, and we need to take a hard look at it, because every time you give Washington authority, you give it up yourself, your own little freedom to determine your own destiny.
Well, I think this has been very productive in the sense that it helps to identify a couple of different ways of looking at the states and the federal government. According to Mr. Chapman, if I have you right, there's a responsibility of the federal government to come in and take care of the inequity and differences between the states.
I couldn't disagree with Barry more in that pollution control would be one of those areas in which there is an appropriate federal role.
But you also believe that we should have education, roads, and health care, and so forth.
I agree. Now, I also would say, though, in Texas, I'm not sure the Arizona experience.
Sure.
But in Texas, we run our schools.
Yeah.
Now, we do it with federal help, but I don't know, the federal government's not running the schools in Texas.
Right.
So.
And Mr. Goldwater, you hold that the states would do a better job if left to themselves, and indeed some of the reason for the disparity between state standards on education, healthcare, and so forth is because the federal government is responsible for states not taking responsibility. And I'm going to leave this difference here because I think it's been worthwhile at least to point that fundamental difference out, and I want to throw a different question at you both, and that is, in light of the different frame of reference, how do we move forward as a nation? How do we move forward as a divided Congress when there is strong ideology on either side? What are your thoughts, Mr. Goldwater?
I'm not sure you do move forward under the circumstances that we live under today, the circumstances of the divided Congress and the executive branch. That will be determined in the 2014 elections.
So there's a political
There's a stalemate going on, and what we need is a breakthrough, and that will happen every election. That's why we have elections, to change the direction.
And so just before our break, Mr. Chapman, what do you think would be the way forward?
There's a one-word answer. It's easy. It's compromise. I can be, I can disagree with Congressman Goldwater and he with me on pick the issue, whether it's health care, whether it's pollution, whatever it may be. But if we're going to be in it together, and we are as Americans, we got to meet in the middle.
Very good. Well,
we have to meet in the middle.
This is fascinating because we're getting a glimpse into the political thinking of these two seasoned long-term congressmen, and a glimpse into something that we have to deal with as we move forward with a goal of moving forward. We'll be right back for our final segment with Representative Barry Goldwater Jr. and Representative Jim Chapman. This is Keli'i AKina on Ehana Kako, and I hope you'll be with us for our final segment.
Aloha, I'm Nicole Horry for ThinkTech. For nearly half a century, the Hawaii Foreign Trade Zone No. 9 has brought the benefits of the Foreign Trade Zone program to Hawaii businesses and entrepreneurs. DBET, the Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism, operates Hawaii's Foreign Trade Zone program to encourage international business and economic development. The Foreign Trade Zone's mission is to increase the amount of international trading activity in Hawaii, thereby providing employment opportunities for the residents of our island state. For more information, see ftz9.org. I'm Nicole Horry. Mahalo.
When you come back, you can take a look over.
Well, we're having a lot of fun during the break now. Representative Barry Goldwater Jr. and Representative Jim Chapman. And in this final 10 minutes, what I'd like to do is ask for their perspectives on an important issue today. The average person in America sees the country divided between red states and blue states, and in different proportions in different states. Here in Hawaii, we're predominantly a Democrat Party state. What is the health, and I'll start with Representative Goldwater, how do you assess the Republican Party right now in the United States? What are your thoughts about that?
I think the Republican Party is in pretty good health. We're alive. We have internal bickering back and forth, but the Republican Party has a core set of principles. We want less government, less intrusion, less taxes, less regulation on our commerce and our business. We want a strong national defense. Every Republican believes that. We believe in individual responsibility. We believe that everyone should be as free as possible. That's the core values of the Republican Party. And we do, yes, we have internal bickering between the Tea Party and the traditionalists. But when it comes down to election time, we will get together. We've got good candidates coming up. I predict that we will take back the United States Senate and keep the House of Representatives in 2014.
Now, Mr. Goldwater, that certainly is optimistic, but a lot of observers see a great deal of conflict between members of the Republican Party, a lot of aiming at each other, and in the midst of that, no clear front runner for president and so forth. Your thoughts, how divided is the party?
I don't think it's divided at all. It's a little bit early to pinpoint a front runner, but I think we have a big, broad spectrum of potential candidates that will evolve by 2016. The Republican Party always squabbles, and so does the Democrats. There's always internal squabbling going on, sometimes more than others. Right now, the Tea Party is telling the traditional Republicans, we're going to toe the line. We don't want any more federal government. We don't want Obamacare. We don't want federal regulation over our lives and over our commerce. We want to back it off. And so you have that internal struggle right now, but it'll all work out by the time the election rolls around.
Well, we'll come right back to you, Mr. Goldwater, after I ask Mr. Chapman not only how you think the Democratic Party is doing now, but to comment on what Mr. Goldwater said about the Republicans, and then I'll let you comment on it.
Well, I think anybody that reads the newspaper, anybody that keeps up with politics in Washington, D.C. in particular, knows the Republican Party is extremely divided. Debates within the party have been divisive. Just last fall's strategy, and as we approach the debt ceiling debate, and Senator, my junior senator from Texas, wanted to shut down the federal government. He has a revisionist view of that now, historical view of that. But John Boehner was torn among the members of the Republican conference in the House by the Tea Party on the right and more traditional Republicans on the left. He let the Tea Party have their way, to disastrous consequences for the Republican Party nationally. So I think it's, however bad it has been for the president and the Democrats, the rollout of Obamacare, and it has been bad, it is balanced by the infighting among Republicans, in my view.
How are the Democrats doing, in your view?
The Democrats are in the minority in the House. They and they don't have a veto-proof or a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate. So the Democrats basically have President Obama, and as we know from the majority leader or the minority leader in the Senate, the number one goal of Republicans in the Senate was to make sure he was a one-term president, and two, to make sure he accomplishes nothing. So Obama has had a struggle. with Congress. One house is led by Republicans, the other is led by Democrats, but with not enough votes, without the 60 votes to break a Republican filibuster. So Obama has had trouble putting his agenda in place, and in fact, one would argue that he's lost many of the big fights he would have loved to have had and won. So, but Democrats, I think, internally are more unified than Republicans. But are they winning the big fights? No. Divided government for all of these different reasons is not working like it should work in Washington.
Well, thank you. Mr. Goldwater, your response to...
Well, very quickly, the House of Representatives controlled by the Republicans, time after time after time, they have voted unanimously to do away with Obamacare. They have voted for changes in Obamacare. They have unanimously worked together to offer alternatives to the Obamacare program. That's unity. That's working together. Yes, we've got our fights between the Tea Parties and the others, but it's not that severe, Jim, as you may think, and as you read in the liberal press and pay homage to. But if you look at the reality of it, Republicans are getting along pretty good.
Well,
I don't think we'll have any problem in rallying the troops for 2014 and taking over the United States Senate and causing Mr. Obama all kinds of trouble.
Mr. Chapman, a last word?
I was going to say that the one issue Republicans agree on is repeal of the Affordable Care Act. They voted 45 times to do it.
Unanimously.
Unanimously,
Yeah,
and
we're
it didn't
not
happen, it
divided.
hasn't happened, and it's not going to happen.
Well,
So-
we'll leave it at that. It's very wonderful to see a vigorous defining difference between Republicans and Democrats here in the state of Hawaii. We have those defining differences, but the balance is not there. And I'm sure that the more balance there is, the greater vigor there will be in the competition of ideas. You've been watching two men who have served our nation, who've sacrificed their lives instead of pursuing business alone or private lives and privacy, have instead gone into the public light. Just for doing that, I say thank you to them, and I thank you very much for being here today. Representative Goldwater.
My pleasure.
Delighted.
Thank you for having
Representative
us, and
Chapman.
thank you for being such a wonderful host.
Well, thank you very
in your
much.
home state.
Signing off today, this is Keli'i AKina with the Grassroots Institute saying thanks to ThinkTech Hawaii, broadcasting across the world. Take a look at the thinktechhawaii.com website. Thanks to Jay Fidel and the whole team. We'll see you back next week on E Hana Kako. Let's work together. Aloha.